If some of you guys are dragging, it's because we lost an hour of sleep. I was sitting there during church while we were singing, and I'm like, why do I feel so tired? Daylight savings. And those of you guys that just now arrived for class, welcome. So this morning, I'm able to bring the message. Joe is home sick today. I encourage you guys to be praying for him so that he can get back to full health soon. So my name is Charlie Vasquez, and I'm our youth minister here, and I have a confession to make. So growing up, Christians, good Christians, have this rite of passage that they do. That if you are a good Christian that was raised in church, you've done this. So this morning I want to confess to you guys, to my family, to God, that I have never watched VeggieTales. And I know for some of you guys may be thinking that this is a salvation issue. I have not watched the dancing tomato and the dancing cucumber. I said celery when I was running over it with Rayanne, and she got very offended. But I have watched the next best thing, which is the Prince of Egypt cartoon movie. And it is one of my favorite movies, not just of Bible or cartoons, but of any genre. So this morning, as we get started, I want to show you guys my favorite clip from one of my favorite movies. So the video should be showing.
Once I called you brother, once I thought the chance to make you laugh was all I ever wanted. And even now I wish that God chose another, serving as your foe on his behalf. It is the last thing that I wanted. This was my home. In pain and devastation, how it tortured me inside. All the innocent to suffer from your stubbornness and pride. You I call brother, why must you call down another blow?
So I love that scene because this morning we're going to be going through the 10 plagues. And I think sometimes when we read from our Bible, especially things from the Old Testament, we hear about plagues and miracles and we don't grasp it. It's something that isn't real. So I love this scene because it paints this picture of what it could have been like. And while I know that some of those things weren't fully biblically accurate, It paints this picture of the terror and the power and the fear that was going through. So this morning, I want to look at the 10 plagues. So turn with me, if you will, to Exodus chapter 7. So as you guys are turning there, I want to give you guys a quick background of Moses. Moses, if you don't know, was a Hebrew. He was of the people of God, but through circumstances and divine will, he ended up being raised in Pharaoh's household. He grew up with Pharaoh, and he viewed Pharaoh's son, who would be the Pharaoh, as a brother. It was a really cool scene that he was able to have this dynamic, as we see in this video here. Moses then goes and kills an Egyptian. He flees and he runs into the wilderness. And in the wilderness, he sees this bush that is on fire but is not burning up. And from this, God tells him to go back to Egypt to get his people out. And Moses has a couple of hesitations. And then finally, God says, take Moses and go anyways. So in chapter 7, we see this first scene where Moses and Aaron come before Pharaoh. And I want to focus in especially on verses 10 through 13. So 10 through 13 says, so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. There's this scene that goes on where Pharaoh says, what God sent you? What miracles do you have? How can you prove that this God is real? And I think when we hear this at first glance, it's almost like an insult, like, who cares? How are you going to stop me? But I think a larger part of it has to do with how battles were done back then. That back in the ancient Near East, the battles weren't just Russia versus Ukraine, but it was God versus God. So when these armies went to battle, whoever God was stronger would be the victorious army. So the Hebrews who have now been in Egypt for 400 years, who were their slaves, their God was either not strong enough, was either dead, or just not there. So when Pharaoh says, what God is this? He's asking, what God is this for real? Same question that Moses asks when he's talking to the burning bush. He says, who will I say sent me? So this is God's moment where he's saying, this is who I am. And as he goes into this, we see kind of this first preamble of this big boxing match that we're about to see. That this serpent comes out. It is Moses and Aaron that God is showing his power, and the magicians are able to copy it. But as we see that this serpent that is of God eats the serpents of Pharaoh, and that's what we're going to be seeing through these 10 plagues, that God continues to devour the gods of Egypt. So as we go to the first plague, which is in chapter 7, verses 14 through 25, we see the plague of the water being turned to blood. So the Nile, if you don't know, is the biggest river for Egypt. This was their lifeblood. This was the river that gave them drinking water, that gave their crops water to grow. This was the way that they would transport stuff up and down in Egypt. This was the most important thing to them. So their God Happy, who was the god of the Nile, was a very important god. You wanted to make sure that this god was taken care of, was worshipped, was happy, so that he would bless you. So God goes after the most important thing to them first, and he says, this water that has been so good to you is now blood, and now you will not have it anymore. So as the Egyptians, Pharaoh brings forth his magicians, and he says, can you copy this? And they make water into blood. They're able to perform the same miracle, but they're not able to save the Nile. The Nile isn't turned back into water. So the Egyptians cry out to Happy. They pray to their God, and their God is silent. And we look at the end of chapter 7, specifically in verse 24. And it says, and all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. that God defeated this God Happy. And then as we go to the second plague, the plague of the frogs in chapter 8, verses 1 through 15, the Egyptians had a god named Hek. Hek was the god of frogs, and in fact, he was a frog himself. So for Egyptians, it was illegal for them to kill frogs. So when the frogs came pouring in, as you guys saw in the scene, the Egyptians could only hope to shoo them away to get them out. And as the magicians were brought forward by Pharaoh, and he said, "Can you repeat this?" They made more frogs that just made the plague even worse. So as the Egyptians, you cry out to Hek, you say, "Hek, can you get these frogs away? Can you keep them from our homes, from everywhere that we are?" And Hek doesn't do anything. God, the God of Aaron and Moses, continues to come after the gods of the Egyptians, and he defeats Hek. And then we go to the third plague, the plague of gnats, which is in Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 through 19. And the god that is closely with this one is the god Geb. He is the god of lice. And as we see this once again, this lice come out. They're trying to do what they can to stop all these plagues. So Pharaoh brings forth his magicians again in chapter 8, verses 18 through 19. And this is the scene that happens. The magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. At this point, there's starting to be a separation, that the magicians of Egypt are no longer able to do these plagues, to do these miracles, and God continues to ramp it up. And these magicians start to realize this is their God. They are starting to see that God of Aaron and Moses is the one true God, and God defeats Geb. And we come to the fourth plague, and this is Exodus chapter 8, verses 20 through 32. And this is the god Khepri that God is attacking here. And in verses 21 through 23, we start to see some more about this story. And it says in verse 21, chapter 8, "Or else, if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants and on your people and into your houses. And the houses of the Egyptians shall be filled with swarms, and also the ground on which they stand. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Thus I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall happen." At this point, it's starting to become more and more clear that these aren't just random events that are plaguing all of this land, but in fact, this was the God of Moses and Aaron that is just hitting the Egyptians. And God's people were starting to be set apart. So God defeats Khepri. We go to the fifth plague, and we see the plague of the death of the livestock in chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. And at this point, God starts to ramp it up, and he doesn't go after just one god, but he starts to go after multiple. There's Isis, who's viewed heifers as sacred. There were bulls that were viewed as sacrifice and were holy to the Egyptians. There was Apis, who was a bull god. There was Hector, who was the cow-headed god. There was Kunam, who was the ram god. And all of these gods that were so important to the Egyptians started to be wiped away as this livestock was killed. These Egyptians had all of these many, many gods, and the Hebrews had one. But this one Hebrew God was knocking down all of the Egyptian gods one by one. And then we go to the sixth plague, the plague of boils in chapter 8, verses 9 through 12. And specifically in verses 10 through 11 of this section, this is what happens. "So they took soot from the Klin and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it became boils, breaking out in sores on man and beast. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians." That these magicians that had been able to copy the plagues at the beginning, that now they not only are not able to do them, but now they can't even stand before Moses and Aaron. They are having to kneel to bow. As we look at the boils, there are several different gods that we see here. There's Imhotep, the god over medicine. There's Sapras, the god over healing. There's Thoth, the god over medical learning. So as these people had these boils on their skin, as they were scraping them off, they cried out to their gods for healing, but there was none. And the God of Moses and Aaron continues to be stronger than these Egyptian gods. And then we come to the seventh plague, the plague of hail. And we see this in chapter 9, verses 13 through 35. This hail starts to come down, and the gods that are hit at this point, there's Nut, the sky goddess. There's Shu, the wind god. There's Horus, the sky god of Upper Egypt. That this hail comes down through their dominion, and they have no ability to stop it. And God defeats Nut and Shu and Horus. Then we look at the eighth plague, the plague of locusts in chapter 10, verses 1 through 20. And we see that these gods of Egypt, there's Nepri, the god of grain. There's Emret, the goddess of crops. There's Thermuthis, the goddess of harvest. There's Seth, the god of crops. And all of these gods are not strong enough to keep the God of Moses and Aaron from destroying all of their crops. And God defeats Nepri and Emret and Theusis and Seth. And then we come to the ninth plague. And it is this ninth plague in chapter 10, verses 21 through 29, that God starts to take off his gloves and starts to go after the Egyptian gods' throats. Because the supreme God, the deity, the father God of all the Egyptian gods is a God named Ra. And he is the sun god. So this ninth plague of darkness goes over Egypt and it makes it dark and the sun is blocked out. He says that this supreme God that is yours, the strongest God that you have, he's not even going to be visible to you anymore. And God defeats Ra. And then we come to the 10th and final plague. This is the death of the firstborn. And we see this in chapter 11, verses 1 through chapter 15 and verse 21. It is in this moment that God says, here you go. Because while there is Mishkneth, the goddess of childbirth, and Isis, the goddess of fertility, and Renulet, the guardian of Pharaoh, the most important god that is killed here is Pharaoh, the next Pharaoh. Because when it's the firstborn of Pharaoh, Pharaoh is viewed and is called the son of God in Egypt. He is viewed as God on earth. This is like Jesus dying. Except for us, Jesus rose, he came back, he was victorious, but the firstborn of Pharaoh was dead. He stayed in the ground. And God went after all of these Egyptian gods, ultimately ending with Pharaoh, when Pharaoh is killed and he is under the sea. These gods are being beaten or being attacked by God. And this is why God does it, that God goes after these Egyptian gods, one, to get his people out. But this is what Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12 says. Turn there with me if you will. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12 says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all of the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." That God was making a point here. He was reminding his Hebrews, his people, that he is the one true God, that he is able to protect them, to save them, to bring them out. But he's telling the Egyptians that all of their gods are not real gods, that they are fake gods. To tell them that the God of Aaron and Moses is real. And we see this even outside of this section here. When you look later in Joshua, the people are afraid and believe that God is the true God, and they say it is because of the plagues that were done to Egypt. That these plagues were to everyone to hear that God is the only true God. So as we see these plagues and this battle that had happened, here are the things I want you guys to take away from this. Number one is that God has control over nature. That as we see that God is able to tell hell to come, hell to stop. And we know that he still has control over nature. That means that the tornadoes that come, the hurricanes that may blow down cities, the volcanic eruption that may happen, the COVID, or whatever the next disease will be, that all of these things are under God's control, that God is more powerful than those things. And this is so important because God may give us victory here, or it may be when we get to heaven and God gives us the ultimate victory. That these things don't have control over us. I remember a couple years ago, I lived in Houston during Harvey, and I've grown up in a bunch of different hurricanes. And there was a point during Harvey when it felt like there would be no sun, like there was no hope, because this went on for days. But I'll let you know that after those days passed, the sun finally broke, and we remembered that the sun is ultimately in control. The second thing that we see is that God has control over creatures. We see this with the livestock, with the frogs, with the lotus, with the lice. That everything that is on this earth, that these things are under God's dominion and control. They are made for his glory and for his pleasure. And it is all meant to honor him. The third thing is that God has control over the universe. That as we see in the ninth plague, that God is able to block out the sun. He is able to tell the sun not to shine anymore. And we see here and in other sections in the Bible that God is able to tell the sun not to shine or tell the sun to shine longer. He is able to tell the earth to stop moving. That God doesn't just have dominion over this one planet here, but he has dominion over every planet, every star and universe in the sky that we see, that God is God over everything. And we come to our fourth point, is that God has control over us. And by that, I don't mean that we don't have free will, because God has graciously given us the free will to choose him or not. But I mean is that God is going to use us for his purpose. And that means that there is a scene at the very end of this movie, this clip, where you saw Moses and Pharaoh on half and half of their faces, and they faced each other. I love that scene because that's the big picture of what's going on here. That you have Pharaoh who says, I have all of these gods, and I myself am more important than God. And we have Moses who, even though he is scared, he humbles himself and says, I'm not God, I'll still go. And we have the choice because both people were used by God. Unfortunately, Pharaoh was used by God in his disaster. And I think that for us is, how are we being used by God? Are we instead saying, you know what, God, I'm more important than you, and I'm going to choose to be in charge of my life? Or are we saying, God, I love you, but you know what, right now work is going to be my God? Or God, I love you, but family is going to be my God right now. Because I think as people, sometimes our gods don't have the name of Imhotep or Ra, but they have work and family or sports or different things. And the same God that fought for Moses is still fighting for us, and that means that he will knock down the gods that are in our lives. Because God's not going to bless anything that we put before him. That means that if we put family, if we put work, if we put anything before him, those things are not going to be blessings. That God wants him to be first. That he is the only true God, and everything can come underneath him. We as people have a choice to make, whether to be like Pharaoh and harden our hearts, or to be like Moses and realize that the God of the Hebrews, the God of Moses and Aaron, the God of Jesus, the God of Paul, is still the God that we serve today, and he is the only one and true God, not us. And maybe this morning you guys are sitting here and you have realized that you have decided to be the God of your life, that you have been living a life that does not reflect God. We can help with that. Or maybe you're sitting here and you have never heard about this one true God of Moses and Aaron, and you want to hear more about him. We can help with that. Or maybe you're sitting here and the things that you love and hold so dearly, you feel like God is away from them and is not blessing them. And maybe it's those priorities out of order, and we can help with that. So this morning, whatever your need is, we're happy to help. You guys can come forward. You can go to the back. You can find me or an elder or any other church member in here. We are happy to help. We just need to know what the need is. I ask that you guys stand as we sing this invitation song.